Another step in the lesson about the building of the state in France during the early modern times. Just a quick reminder of what was seen in the previous lessons. They focused on the birth of the modern state from the reign of Francis I to the reign of Henry IV, and within between the wars of religion that were probably a moment when the state was threatened in its unity, and so which encouraged the kings to make it even more united and centralized. And so in this second part, I will examine the big moment of the building of this modern state before the French Revolution, of course, which was done in a way that actually became some kind of French model, which was the system of absolute monarchy. And the chronology would be rather long because it will start with the assassination of Henry IV in 1610 and last until the French Revolution of 1789, even though my approach in this second part will mostly be about some important issues and not really a chronology. Anyway, before anything else, it is important to have a look at this expression of absolute monarchy. To illustrate this moment of definition, I chose this painting, which is actually an official portrait of King Louis XV, produced in 1715, that is to say the date, the year when Louis XV became the new king of France, when his great-grandfather Louis XIV died. Louis XV was clearly the new king, so he embodied the French state, but he was only a child. It illustrates the fact that in this system of monarchy, not only absolute monarchy, but what is important is that the king embodies the state. The king is the state. And what is remarkable is that on this poster, young Louis XV carries many of the symbols of the French monarchy that also appeared on the official portrait of his predecessor. Anyway, even though at that moment Louis XV did not actually govern because he was too young, and so it was the beginning of a moment that we call the regency, which means that somebody else will act as a kind of king while the king is being educated. So despite regency, officially the king's power remains absolute. Okay, it's only temporary that somebody else will govern while the king is too young. And so it leads me to this first important idea, which is that absolute monarchy is a concept, a doctrine, not something that was completely true in reality, but something very important in theory. And so in theory, absolute monarchy is a political system in which the king, or the monarch, rules supreme, which means that he actually governs and has all the dimensions of power: military power, legislative power, executive power, even religious power to a certain extent in France. And the reason why the king rules supreme is that his sovereignty, which means the source of all these powers, relies on nothing but itself. Okay? This is what we call an autocratic regime. You may know the term democratic, which means that power, kratos, comes from the people, demos. But in autocratic, it means that power comes from itself. There is nothing that justifies power except that, power is self-justified. In the case of absolute monarchy, it was not exactly this that was said to the people. It was said that it was the will of God that made the king the legitimate monarch of France. This is what was called the principle of divine right, but we'll examine that more in detail later. So as I said, all this is not entirely true in reality, because in reality every power is based to a certain extent on the consent of the people, on the fact that the people accept to be governed. And so even an absolute king needs to use force, needs to use compromise, and so his absolute power is in fact a fiction, because his power is limited in practice. But maybe nowhere else than in France at that moment did the power of the king grow so high. Because indeed the French model left a very large authority to the king. And this had many impacts on the country's political history, I believe even until today. Anyway, if we go back to the early modern times, my first point will be about the building of the basis of absolute monarchy. And I will mostly talk about the reign of Louis XIII and some years in the beginning of the reign of young Louis XIV. First point, and actually the key actor here will not be the king, but his main minister Richelieu, whose policy aimed to assert king's power. So the king was Louis XIII. He became king when Henry IV died. I believe it was the son of Henry IV. He was a bit too young to rule at the beginning, and so in his government, in his council, the key role was after 14 years, in 1624, was given to Cardinal Richelieu, who was a churchman, very high in the hierarchy of the church, and also a very educated man, a lawyer, and he was progressively chosen as the chief minister and the actual ruler of France, in the sense that, well, no, not exactly. He did not rule, but he made most of the decisions. He advised the king, and the king ruled, but Richelieu was the man who was maybe the brain and also the hand of the king, if you see what I mean. So what Richelieu wanted to do was nothing really new, increasing the king's power against all the other political actors that may find it challenging, that may not accept this increase of king's power. And the assassination of Henry IV, like before him Henry III, proved that king's power was always under threat. So securing the king's dominant position in the state was really the aim of Richelieu. And the first thing that Richelieu believed needed to be done was to control the enemies within. The enemy within means that inside France you have some people, some actors that may be opposed to king's power, and so that may be a danger for him. And Richelieu knew that there were basically two kinds of enemies within. The princes, those that in French could be named les grands, the most important nobles of the kingdom, those who belonged to these families of lords who had been present for a long time in the French monarchy, and by tradition, according to the medieval feudal system, had a certain authority on some provinces or on some parts of the state. So he knew that this high nobility had to be forced to be obedient. He was also very wary and suspicious of the existence of some Protestant places, places that were militarily controlled by Protestants, which, as you may remember, was one of the decisions of the Edict of Nantes. The existence of these Protestants, named Huguenots at that moment in France, was still seen like something threatening the unity of the kingdom for Richelieu. And one of the most famous and spectacular events of this struggle against the Protestants' power in France was a military battle, actually. For 2 years, La Rochelle, which was the last remaining place forte controlled by the Protestants in the country, was besieged by the armies of the king under the leadership, at least political leadership, of Richelieu. And in 1628, La Rochelle surrendered, and it was the moment when the Protestants had no more military and independent influence in the country. So that's quite a famous event in the history of France. The other point for Richelieu was to secure the natural interest, what he used to name la raison d'État. The remarkable point here is, we are talking about foreign policy largely, is that there was an apparent contradiction between the fact that at home Richelieu opposed to the Protestants, but at the international level, under his command, France was allied to some Protestant states. And this was because for 30 years there was a war, which is named this way, the 30 Years' War, between the European Catholic power of the Habsburg family, so mainly Spain and what used to be called the Spanish Netherlands, today Belgium, so some Catholic regions, and some Protestant states, mostly in the north of Central Europe, and you can see them on this map. And so by 1635, France entered this 30 Years' War, but on the side of the Protestants, because Richelieu and the king, they believed that it was France's national interest to help the enemies of Spain, because Spain was the enemy of France. Okay. So for Richelieu, this contradiction has no importance, because in fact his opposition to Protestants at home was not based on religious grievances. It was an opposition with a political goal to secure the unity of the state and to base this unity on the principle of loyalty to the king and to his religion, the Catholic religion. The other reason why I'm mentioning the 30 Years' War was that France's intervention in this war was very expensive. And so it leads me to the third point. Richelieu knew that he had to strengthen the state's grip on the country in order to fund, in order to finance these wars at the international level. So two things had to be done, and again, nothing really illogical or strange. Richelieu decided an important raise of taxation. Okay, so it increased the wealth of the state, the revenue of the state, but it could also lead to some anger in the country. And second point, at the administrative level, it's under Richelieu's office that all over the kingdoms, new officers called the intendants were appointed, and contrary to the officers of the parliaments who owned their office, and so in a way had some kind of autonomy, here the intendants were nominated, appointed by the king, and in each province of the country they represented the king with the goal to enforce the law, which means make sure the law is respected and put in practice, and also they had to secure the collection of taxes and to transfer some information to the central government. So with the intendants, there was another step in the building of a centralized state, where from the head of the state, from the king in Paris, a good control, a good grip on every province of the kingdom was made possible. But the second point in part A is about, well, the logical reaction that happened in the country, in the kingdom, in front of this growth of the state's power. And the episode that I will talk about now, known as La Fronde in French, and we could call that the rebellion, but in fact even the English-speaking historians, they talk about the Fronde, was one last attempt to stop this process of growth of the king's power at the expense of the power of the nobles. So it was a rebellion that was not really a popular rebellion made by common people, peasants that were angry about taxations, even though this anger was present, and that's the reason why, to a certain point, many French people supported the Frondeurs, the rebels. Now, it was more a rebellion of the nobles. It all happened at the head of the French society, at the top of the society. This took place between approximately 1648 and 1653, and it was in fact a series of civil wars. At that moment, Louis XIV was a child. He was very young, and so he was not actually governing, but his chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, I don't know, maybe in English we should say Mazarin, but never seen that, never heard that before. So Cardinal Mazarin, the successor of Richelieu, was actually ruling the country. And like Richelieu, his goal was to keep on raising new taxes and to secure king's power. But it was met with a very active opposition in 1648 because the parliaments, so I need to remind you that the parliaments, who were several in the country, were assemblies of noble officers whose role was to be tribunals, but also their role was to record the law, and they could criticize the law. Okay, you may watch a previous video to revise that. And so these members of the parliaments refused some new taxes, notably because they should be taxed, and they did not want that. They believed they had what they called the liberté not to pay taxes, which in fact we should name the privilege not to pay taxes. Anyway, their opposition was so active that the state was compelled to use military power against them. Okay, you can see here on the illustration one rebel, member of the Parliament of Paris, calling the people to stand up and fight against what he calls the tyranny of Cardinal Mazarin. Okay, So I think it's pretty well illustrates the ideas of the members of the Fronde. They refused this central power, which was becoming, in their opinion, too strict, too authoritarian, too strong. So I said at one point the king, the government in the name of the king, believed that military power had to be used against the rebels. The problem was that the army was not totally loyal to the state. It was largely loyal to some princes that dominated the army. And in fact, some princes, some of the most important princes of the kingdom, and I will take only one example, Le Prince de Condé, who was a cousin of the young king, by the way. These members of the high nobility, they also wanted to stop this process of the growth of king's power and the reduction of the power of the nobles. They refused decentralization. So several princes, including Le Grand Condé, who was maybe the most powerful man in France at that moment, they opposed the government of Mazarin, and they led France in a civil war, which means that the king's armies were fighting armies led by other French princes. That was a real civil war. At that moment, the kingdom in France, the monarchy, was in great danger. In fact, you must understand that the French monarchy was challenged by some important princes of the country, to a point when Le Grand Condé, that prince, Louis de Bourbon, he made an alliance with France's biggest enemy in Europe, Spain. Okay. And he was almost betraying his country, even though this did not mean a lot at that moment. It was all a question of personal relationship to one king or another. So at one point, some French princes were fighting other French princes that had remained loyal to the king. Eventually, Le Grand Condé surrendered, and he promised to be loyal to the king, and he asked for the king's forgiveness, which he obtained in 1660. Okay, that is illustrated in a way on that painting, which was made much later. The year after, Mazarin had died. Okay, and so you had the young king, Louis XIV, Louis XIV, that had seen all these events, that remembered the Fronde, that remembered how threatened he could be by the nobles. And he also knew that some of his predecessors had to fight against the nobles, and some had been killed. And so he was more determined than any of his predecessors to accelerate the process of modernization of the French state as an absolute monarchy. And we'll see in part B what Louis XIV did in order to improve even more the king's power in France.